John Herschel Glenn Jr. was born on July 18, 1921, in Cambridge, Ohio, the only son of a railroad conductor who also owned a plumbing business, and the former Clara Sproat. A few years later, the Glenns moved to New Concord, a small town in southeastern Ohio with a population of little more than 1,000. Glenn once said, "Wanting to do something for the country was just natural, growing up in a place like New Concord." Like most everyone else there, the Glenns lived through the hard times of the Depression, instilling in their son a rigid moral code based on their own God-fearing example, and saw him through an apple pie boyhood. In high school, now named for him, he was an honor student and lettered in football, basketball, and tennis. He still had time to court his high school sweetheart, Anna Margaret Castor, the doctor's daughter. It did not matter that she stammered, she was his girl, and he loved her. From the time they came to public attention, and throughout the turbulence of spaceflight and politics, John and Anna Glenn each seemed the other's center of gravity. Mr. Glenn is survived by his wife, 2 children, Carolyn Ann Glenn of St. and 2 grandsons, Daniel and Zach Glenn. Mr. Glenn began his journey to fame in World War II. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, he signed up for the Naval Aviation Cadet Program and after pilot training opted to join the Marines. As a fighter pilot, he flew 59 combat missions in the Pacific, earning 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and other decorations. Glenn saw more action in the Korean War, flying 90 combat missions and winning more medals. He put his life on the line again as a military test pilot in the early days of supersonic flight. In 1957, just months before the Soviet Union launched its first Sputnik satellite, he made the first transcontinental supersonic flight, piloting an F-8U-1 Crusader from Los Angeles to New York in record time, 3 hours 23 minutes 8. Then, in 1959, newly promoted to lieutenant colonel, he heeded a call for test pilots to apply to be astronauts for the fledgling National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He and 6 other pilots were selected in April of that year. The original Mercury 7 included Mr. Shepard, Mr. Grissom, Walter Schirra, Gordon Cooper, Deke Slayton, and Scott Carpenter. Mr. All 7 men were eager, competitive, and ambitious, but none more so than Mr. Glenn. Tom Miller, a retired Marine general and close friend since they were rookie pilots in World War II, recalled that Mr. He wasn't going to miss a trick, Mr. Miller said. He'd be sitting down reading with a big bunch of books sitting on his head. He had to wait out the suborbital flights by Mr. Shepard and Mr. Grissom in 1961 before his turn came. Shepard was tapped for the first flight. As the oldest and most articulate of the astronauts, Mr. Glenn had attracted a big share of the publicity. In a letter to a NASA official, Mr. Glenn wrote, "I thought I might have been penalized for speaking out for what I thought was the good of the program." At this time, as Mr. Tom Wolfe wrote of that time in the best-selling 1979 book The Right Stuff, a phrase for coolness in the face of danger that has passed into the idiom. He described Mr. Glenn as excessively pious, scolding his fellow astronauts about their after-hours escapades while openly lobbying to be the first of them to fly. Wolfe wrote, "He had a snub nose, light hazel eyes, reddish blonde hair, and a terrific smile." Mr. Most of his account was reasonably factual, although I was neither the pious saint nor the other guys the hellions he made them into, he told Life magazine in 1998. Hollywood made a charade out of the story and caricatures out of the people in it. The 1962 space mission came after 2 months of one postponement after another, sometimes for mechanical problems, often for bad weather. Glenn had to wait 6 hours, fully suited, in the cramped Friendship 7 capsule before officials called off the launch. But he projected confidence. "You fear the least what you know the most about," he said. The flight stopped the nation in its tracks. People watched on black and white television, listened on the radio and prayed. At the end of the first orbit, an automatic control mechanism failed, and Mr. Glenn took over manual control. He puzzled for a while about fireflies outside his window. NASA later determined that it was his urine and sweat, which was being dumped overboard and turned to frozen crystals glowing in sunlight. A faulty warning light signaled that the capsule heat shield, designed to protect it in the fiery descent back to Earth, had come loose and might come off during re-entry. The signal was erroneous, but no one could be sure. Ground controllers ordered that a retro-rocket unit attached under the heat shield by metal straps not be jettisoned after firing in order to give added protection and reduce the risk of premature detachment of the heat shield. This was Mr. Glenn's first real clue that something was amiss. As Friendship 7 plunged through the atmosphere, the astronaut's recorded heartbeat raced as one of the metal straps came loose and banged on the side of the capsule. Right away, I could see flaming chunks flying by the window, and I thought the heat shield might be falling apart, he wrote after the flight. This was a bad moment. But I knew that if that was really happening, it would all be over shortly, and there was nothing I could do about it. The capsule splashed down in the Atlantic off the Bahamas, where a Navy destroyer was waiting. Mr. Glenn radioed, "My condition is good, but that was a real fireball, boy." In the flush of fame, Mr. Glenn toured the country publicizing the space program, visiting aerospace plants and waving to cheering crowds and signing autographs. But he always had his eye on another flight into space. He kept asking NASA officials about a new flight assignment and was routinely stonewalled. "Not yet," they said. Kennedy's reservations about risking a hero's life were disclosed years later. Frustrated, Mr. Glenn resigned from NASA in early 1964. But an idea for a new career had been planted in his mind. One night in December 1962, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy invited the Glenns to dinner at his home in McLean, VA. In the course of the evening, the Attorney General suggested that Mr. Glenn run for public office. With the backing of a powerful Kennedy, he might have a good chance at a Senate seat from Ohio in the 1964 election. Mr. Glenn's parents happened to be among the few Democrats in New Concord, and Mr. Glenn once recalled that he had developed an abiding interest in political affairs from his high school civics teacher, Harford Steele. Mr. Glenn eventually took the advice, but had to quit the race after being seriously injured in a bathroom fall. He spent the next decade working as an executive of the Royal Crown Cola Company. He still had the space itch, though, and inquired about a possible place on one of the Apollo missions to the moon, but NASA gave him no encouragement. "Yeah, I would have liked to go to the moon," he said in later years. "But I didn't want to stick around being the oldest astronaut in training just hoping to go to the moon. So I went on to other things, and that was a decision I lived with." After Robert Kennedy's assassination in 1968, Mr. Glenn headed a bipartisan lobbying group called the Emergency Committee for Gun Control. President Lyndon B. Johnson later signed the Gun Control Act of 1968, placing some restrictions on firearms. In 1970, Mr. Glenn ran again for the Senate, but lost in the Democratic primary to Howard M. Metzenbaum. Mr. Glenn won the primary 4 years later and breezed to victory in the general election, beginning a 24-year Senate career. Over the years, Mr. Glenn earned the respect of Senate colleagues as an upright, candid, and diligent legislator. Senator Bob Graham, Democrat of Florida, described Mr. Glenn as a workhorse who was especially well informed and a forceful voice on defense issues. "When he speaks, you know he is speaking on a subject of which he has a command and a reason for speaking," Mr. Graham said shortly before Mr. Glenn's return to space. As a senator, Mr. Glenn developed an expertise in weapons systems, nuclear proliferation issues and most legislation related to technology and bureaucratic reform. He generally took moderate positions on most issues, though in his last 2 terms his voting record became more liberal. He was an enthusiastic supporter of President Bill Clinton. He drew admiring audiences in his run for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1984, but his wooden speaking style and lack of a cogent campaign message were blamed for his poor showing at the polls. After losses in several states, he dropped out of the race, which former Vice President Walter F. Mondale won before President Ronald Reagan overwhelmed him in the general election. The one blemish on Mr. Glenn's squeaky clean political reputation came in the 1980s, when he was one of 5 senators present at a meeting with federal regulators concerning accusations of savings and loan association fraud against Charles H. Keating Jr., a former Ohioan. The meeting smacked of impropriety and political pressure. Because Mr. Glenn had no further contact with Mr. Keating, who eventually was sent to prison, the Senate decided that he did nothing deserving discipline. As a member of the Senate Special Committee on Aging, Mr. Glenn developed the medical rationale used in arguing his case for a return flight in space. He offered himself as a human guinea pig in tests of the physiological effects of space weightlessness, like bone mass loss and cardiovascular, muscular, and immune system changes, and how they seem to be comparable to the usual effects of aging. Mr. Glenn's return to space in 1998 drew criticism. But the new old astronaut was not to be denied, and his heroic image, and reawakened memories of the early space age, attracted launching crowds on a scale not seen since astronauts were flying to the moon. Still healthy and vigorous, though not as agile as in 1962, Mr. Glenn embarked on his second venture in space, as he said in an interview, to show the world that the lives of older people need not be dictated by the calendar.